welcome. It's another Confessions podcast, first for 2015. Happy New Year and all that. So here come another selection of sinful tales from the rather naughty Radio 2 listener. This week we have a bit of a panto palaver, a vintage dress disaster, a foggy furore and a loco commotion. Hey, it's our first confession of the new year. Thank you very much indeed for the hundreds which are coming over of the new year. It does seem that a lot of bad things have been happening, and now the jury is assembled one more time. Deadly is here, the Dean of Deadliness has made a return.
Happy New Year to you.
Thank you very much indeed. Sister Rebecca and Brother Matthew here, all geared up and ready to go. This one comes from Sue. Thank you so much, Sue, for our first confession of the new year. Father Simon, the Drive Time elves and your faithful flock of Drive Time listeners, I seek forgiveness for a seasonal Drive Time misdemeanour. Every year in Edinburgh, the pantomime at the King's Theatre is a big deal.
Oh, no, it
especially with... This is your dream, isn't it, really? Have you ever done panto?
This is... No, I haven't. No, I'd love to. Shall I? Let's do it next year.
All offers considered.
Yeah, all offers will be considered.
At the right price.
Yeah, travel and accommodation needed.
Look, there's your career, where it's behind you. All that kind of stuff. Very good.
Yes, thank you.
Dame Deadly is available for next season. Anyway,
you.
Sue continues,
yes,
despite interruption. Every year in Edinburgh, the pantomime at the King's Theatre is a big deal, especially with the primary schools, who make block bookings and fill the theatre with excited, sugar-fuelled children eager to hiss and boo, particularly at Grant Stott, the wonderfully bad baddie of the show each year. This confession involves the sweets that are an essential for every child at every performance. One year, I've actually had to then take out a few stories.
Have you?
One year, largely revolving throwing sweets from the balcony.
I know you can't do that anymore.
One year, our daughters, Michaela and Cosima, with their friend Emily, gathered their flashing reindeer ears, practiced their boos and hisses, and set off excitedly to school, late as usual, in Mum's car.
Okay.
Baby Marcella stayed at home with Dad. The only thing missing was sweets to take to the panto, and the three girls nagged and begged loudly and pleadingly all the way along the road to the local store. I pointed out how extremely late we were, and that they could survive, surely they could survive just the duration of a pantomime without sweets. But as we approached the store, the pleading rose to a frenzy of sweetie names wailed at a high pitch that could not be ignored any longer. I pulled up outside the store, harassed, and weary, with a muddle of sweet names fighting in my head, grabbing whatever bags of sweets I thought would not melt, get sticky, choke the children or injure anyone if used as a missile. Another confession altogether. I joined the chatty, slow-moving queue. We were very, very late. I was more and more harassed and harassed. I ran to the car, swung the back door open and threw the bags of sweeties into the car, one by one, calling out their names. One of the bags split on impact, leaving unnaturally flavoured, sugary treats everywhere. I shrieked, "Are you blooming well satisfied now?"
Wow,
spitting out the word satisfied with all the vehemence I could muster. I was harassed and harassed. There was an odd silence, and strangely, I found myself face to face with a rather startled baby in a car seat. It flashed through my mind that baby Marcella was at home with Dad, and it began to dawn on me that this was not, in fact, her at all. I ventured to look round the rest of the car and was met with an anxious look on the face of the lady in the driver's seat. Actually, anxious doesn't do her face justice. It was a look of unutterable alarm. A wide-eyed child was seated in the passenger seat, and another two children in the back seat stared longingly at the sweets that had scattered. I realised that none of the children were in fact mine, and that this was confirmed when I looked to the car parked in front of this one and saw Michaela, Cosima and Emily laughing heartily through the rear window. I retreated, apologising rather weakly. Oh, I got the wrong car. As I walked to my own car, I could hear loud laughter from the girls who were pointing to a newspaper with the headline, "Escaped prisoner, dangerous, do not approach." I'm reasonably sure that escaped prisoners don't invade cars and hand out sweets, but anyway, I do need to ask forgiveness, dear Father Simon, for being scarier than Grant Stott in the panto role of his super scary pantomime baddie, also for disrupting the school run of the mum in the navy blue car that looked ever so like mine, with the startled baby that looked a little like mine, and the three wide-eyed children who looked nothing like mine at all. And finally, I ask forgiveness for flaunting an array of sweets in front of her children who thought Christmas was still happening. I hope you can forgive me, says Sue, who got entirely the wrong car but was a little harassed and paid the price. What do you think, Sister Rebecca? It's our first panto confession.
Well, I've been there. It's hilarious what a harassed mother will do on those occasions. So I can completely understand where she's coming from. Presumably she picked up the sweets after she'd thrown them at the children who weren't hers. That's the implication, I think, from the story. So I feel sorry for the mother who had to clean up the sticky mess in the car, but I'm sure being a mother, she would understand, so I am forgiving.
Don't throw sweets at the panto, obviously. Dearest Deadly, what do you make of that?
I'm in a forgiving mood already, I think. Yeah, I think I'll forgive. And the kids in the car did benefit. They got the sweets, for goodness sake.
Well, I think they probably did. You see, I think she just beat a
left them in there. She'd have thought, leave it. I'm going to get out of here quickly. Did she get sweets for her own kids, though? For her own children, did we say? Because she needs to go and get some more.
We don't know.
We don't know. I'm afraid that'll have to be for
back
another...
into the shop.
For
back
another
into the shop,
day.
Get some more sweets.
Brother,
but yeah, it was a mistake. It was
Brother
a mistake.
Matthew.
Be forgiving.
Yes, I've got lots of questions about what we don't know has happened regarding this story. Number one,
Yes.
I don't like people throwing things at me in my car. However, if you are going to throw something at my car, then sweets. I will take sweets, absolutely, no problem with that. So I am going to say definitely forgiven because, you know, it's sweets, isn't it? Sweets in the back of the car. What's wrong with that? And also, it meant that the kids didn't have any sweets in the panto, and they would have been even more hyper. So good news all round.
So if someone chucks some Spangles at you,
yes,
and an opal fruit,
Haribos,
that's going to be absolutely fine, is it?
Absolutely no problem at all.
Okay, we'll remember that one. Anita sends in tonight. Dear Father Simon and the Holy Collective. It was in the... is there a PG certificate on this one?
Has this been checked?
Good.
Slightly PG?
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
12A, is it?
No, it's not 12A.
Oh.
It's sort of a P.
Is this the watershed?
Not really.
Okay.
Dear Father, Son and Holy Collective, it's the mid-80s and I'm living in a small village in Hertfordshire where I met a guy, let's call him Bob, at a party. It's very nice and we get on very well and subsequently we start seeing each other. Bob was serving in the army and was based at barracks in London. Only after a short time of dating, I was invited to accompany him to a military ball, which promised to be quite a grand affair and would require me to wear a posh frock. This was a slight problem, as my daily working commute into London and general living left me with very little spare cash. What to wear? This is the question. A solution came in the form of a vintage dress, or second-hand, as we called it back then. My grandmother had a 1950s black cocktail dress. It was strapless with a low back. The bodice was heavily boned.
Bodice.
It was... Have you not heard that word for a while?
It's a great word, isn't it? Bodice. I love it.
Gets Alan going. There's the PG already.
Bodice. Yeah, sorry.
Okay. It's 12A. This bodice was heavily boned. Whalebone or Bakelite, I'm not sure which, but it was heavy and rigid.
Bakelite.
But it did look the part. You know Bakelite?
I've got Bakelite radios.
Yes, it's early kind of plastic.
Yeah.
I must explain here that because it was strapless, low at the back and heavily boned, it was impossible...
It's the way you say boned that worries me.
It was impossible to wear a bra underneath it. Now, I realise that we're sort of flag waving here.
Okay.
The night of the grand military ball arrived and the evening was fabulous. Wonderful food, wonderful drink and young men in full military regalia. What more could a girl want? And I felt great, so much so that when I was dancing with Bob, I really went for it. I don't know whether it was the wine, the uniform or the live band, but I decided to do a twirl, something I'd never done before and I haven't done since. My twirl consisted of raising my hands above my head and turning. Unfortunately, mid-twirl, I realised that the dress hadn't moved. I had moved within the dress. And so my front was now at the back of the dress and I was now facing the top table, somewhat uncovered. In fact, ridiculously uncovered. Such fleshy scenes might be appropriate on some beaches in Greece, but at a military affair, in front of the top brass and under a painting of Her Majesty, dearie me, no! 1,000 times no! It did seem to take an age to take in the open mouths, the sharp intake of breaths, and I'm afraid to say titters of laughter. However, I regained my composure.
I didn't say it.
Regain your composure.
Okay.
And pulled my dress around to cover up, and then I turned to face a shocked Bob. I carried on as if nothing had happened. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Smile, laugh, keep calm, carry on. I was prepared to grin and bear it. But, Father Simon, I need forgiveness from Bob, who couldn't look me in the eye after this incident. I believe he had to endure a fair amount of teasing from his fellow officers. Striking woman you got there, Bob? That's one way to impress the generals, Robert.
Striking.
Are you going to see more of her in future? And so on and so on. Needless to say, the relationship couldn't cope with my exposure. So it fizzled out. So I have to say sorry to Richard and to the top table and Her Majesty. I do sometimes wonder what would have happened if I'd worn a vest. I also... Many people have thought that, Anita, over the years.
Yes.
I also seek forgiveness from friends and family who weren't there to witness my shame that night, but who believed that the evening had been a resounding success and that I'd been the belle of the ball. Their support and indignation when Bob inexplicably moved on from our courtship was very sweet, but I totally brought it all on myself with my bodice. Forgiveness, please, says Anita. I think that's a PG. Anyway. We get the people's verdict, but Sister Rebecca has her head girl face
I think that's what's called a severe wardrobe malfunction, isn't it?
It is.
When
Nowadays,
that happens
yes, that's
to
true.
celebrities and the like. It's not her fault. It happens all the time. I think a vest would have looked terrible, actually, so that would have been more of a crime than what she did.
Well, because it had a low back, so you can't really wear
You can't
a
wear a
vest.
vest under it, exactly. So I think maybe she should
Certainly
be more
I find
careful.
that anyway.
But exactly. No, I'm going to forgive.
Yeah.
I think Bob was being a bit prudish, actually,
I
for
feel
leaving her for that.
Yeah, and it was
you
just
know?
it was a complete mistake.
I say,
Alan,
poor
that's happened to you, hasn't it?
Poor all the time it happens to me. All the time. Poor show Bob is what I say for dumping Anita just on the basis of that. Shocking behaviour. Her Majesty was only a picture anyway, so I don't think she'd have been too worried about it in that sense. And it was accidental. It was accidental. My favourite line from the story, grin and bear it. Grin and bear
Keep
it.
calm and carry on. Brother
Exactly.
Matthew.
Keep calm, Matthew.
Yes. Never having worn a backless dress, I've
come
no
on, what's the
idea
matter
whether
with
it's
you?
a good...
There's a first time
it
for
strikes
everything.
me as there's not a good idea to do a twirl
What are you doing
if you're
Saturday?
wearing a backless dress, because there's particularly hands in the air, strikes me there's a chance that something might happen. So
ridiculous.
I think that was throwing a little bit of caution to the wind there. And
So it's her own fault?
Well, I'm tempted to say that, but then
This
Bob...
from a man who's never worn a
Well,
dress.
yes, Bob dumping her because of that seems a little bit extreme. And
Yes,
these military dances, they're all pretty stuffy affairs anyway. Actually, I'm changing my mind. I'm going to say forgiven just because of the military thing and Bob.
Does this kind of thing ever happen on Strictly?
Not really, no. We wouldn't countenance that sort of thing.
Just checking. Here's another dry tie confession. Everybody gather round.
Right.
This one from Peter.
Peter.
Who sends this to confessions@bbc.co.uk. Dear Father Simon, as I near my 75th birthday, I feel the time has come to confess to something that has weighed on my conscience for the past 60 years. So this is a vintage confession. Need to
Very
go
good.
with the vintage clothing.
Vintage.
Thank you. As a young lad of 15, I worked as an apprentice fitter in a company called J&E Hall in Dartford in Kent. This was 1955, at a time when London's smog could bring the city and its surroundings to a standstill.
Pea super.
It is difficult for the modern person to appreciate how terrible the smog could be. Thicker than any fog. When it was at its worst, you couldn't see the ground that you were walking on, or literally the hand in front of your face. It was caused by the large amount of coal being burnt at the time, which led to the air being filled with soot particulates from smoke, sulphur dioxide and other nasty stuff.
We're laughing and learning here, aren't we?
Particulates.
Thank you very much indeed.
Mostly learning, but yeah.
That's right. The word itself, smog, for younger listeners, was a combination of smoke and fog. I am sure it seems that I'm going into unnecessary detail, but in order to understand what happened next, it is important to appreciate that smog really did make it difficult to see clearly. Ordinary life appeared impossible. Walking to the shops was impossible.
Well, there were ships in the way, that's
Ships,
why.
shipping,
Get those ships out of the way!
Is that intentional?
Yes. Have you picked the right one, then?
shipping was very, very difficult and problematic.
Oh, there it is, yes!
It's a real pea super. Get your foghorn out. As we used to say in the 50s.
Yes.
Anyway, where are we on this? I can't remember.
no idea.
Peter continues.
Yes.
I lived in Sidcup at the time, and my friend Len and I would cycle to and from the factory every morning and evening. We used the road that went alongside Dartford Heath, which is a huge open common covering over 300 acres of open ground. Our bikes were proper old bone shakers with big round red brake lights, but served us well, managing the 5-mile journey to work easily. One day in winter, the smog was so bad, the young apprentices were allowed to leave the factory early in order to get home safely. The nights were drawing in, and with the smog spreading across from London, the journey home was going to be very difficult.
Don't go anywhere near the river.
One day in winter... Oh, I've done that bit. Len and I saddled up and made our way off into the smog, peering through the gloom and scanning the way ahead carefully to ensure that we didn't send pedestrians flying or drive into the path of a bus.
Yep.
The smog was so thick, it took us an hour to travel the 2 miles to reach Dartford Heath. Len and I cycled slowly through the smog side by side with our lights on, but they didn't make it any easier to see. Slowing even more, we scanned the way carefully before taking the turning into the road that led to Bexley. Continuing to ride side by side, Len and I found the pedalling to be harder and harder, and through the suffocating smog I couldn't help feeling that something was wrong. I called out to Len as I could barely make out his form in the smog, but he was concentrating on keeping his bike upright, and I just got a grunt in reply. Unfortunately, what we had actually done was to miss the turning into the Bexley Road altogether, and we'd cycled instead onto the off-road dirt track paths, which led to the glory bumps for which Dartford Heath was famous. These glory bumps were huge bumps and troughs formed in the 19th century. You're learning and laughing again now, Matt.
Glory bumps.
Industrial works left hills and hollows of 2 metres in the earth. Certainly not somewhere you'd want to ride your bike in conditions where you could hardly see your handlebars, let alone the road. We briefly paused and got off our bikes and then, with a mounting sense of horror, looked behind us to see a long stream of headlights. Only then did we realise that we had unwittingly led at least 50 cars into the depths of Dartford Heath, mistaking our side-by-side brake lights for the tail lights of a car. The traffic from the main road had just followed us through the smog and onto Dartford Heath, trusting us to lead them to safety. I looked at Len. He looked at me. In a moment of wordless agreement, we reached down and turned off our brake lights and vanished into the darkness, leaving a line of vehicles trapped in the middle of Dartford Heath, wondering what on earth had happened to the car that they were following, which seemed to have just disappeared into thin air. Spooky, scary, particularly for the poor people who had to abandon their vehicles until the smog had cleared.
What's that?
There were wolves on Dartford Heath
Of course there were.
in the 50s. All I can say is that we had no idea that we were being followed until it was too late. So I seek forgiveness from all the people who had to find their own way home in the wolf-infested heath.
That's not a wolf. That's a
Random
dog.
use of the BBC soundtrack CDs.
It's an Alsatian.
That's
Get it
artistic
off.
licence there, isn't it?
Where fogs.
What else works with fog? We can't play that fog on again.
Completely
What about the
confused about
wolves?
where we are.
Anyway, what he just wants forgiveness because they were just cycling side by side, led 50 cars onto the heath. They had to be abandoned and people had to work their own way home. That's what happened. Do you need any more detail?
No, I think that's more than enough, to be
I
honest.
think that's more than enough. So, Sister Rebecca, what do you think about that? What do you think about this vintage confession from Peter?
I think that was a lovely atmospheric tale.
Thank you
and
very much.
it really, brought to mind the body of water somewhere there, which wasn't there, and the wolves, which weren't there. Bit confusing, really. But
there were wolves
first
in
of all-
Dartford in the 50s.
were there?
Yeah.
These people
Not
didn't
barking
do
like
it.
that, they
These
were.
apprentices didn't lead the motorists on purpose.
No, they didn't,
mislead
no.
them there on purpose. So, and also the cars shouldn't be just following whoever's in front of them. They should, try and find their own way, I think. So it wasn't their fault, and they're forgiven.
It was a confession period costume, I think. What do you make of that?
I
Alan?
thought it was very, 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 very good. Very
Evocative.
effective, evocative, and helped to a certain degree by the sound effects. Peter and Len, you are forgiven by me. Yes. Down, boy, down. Peter and Len, you are forgiven. It was accidental all along anyway, and yet they were idiots for following two bikes. What's the matter with these people anyway, for goodness sake?
Well, they thought it was a car.
And you should have got off earlier, really. That would have helped to a certain extent. It would have helped yourselves. But on the principle that you escaped the wolves, well done.
Brother Matthew, what say you?
Any confession gets forgiven for using the term glory bumps. I've never heard of that before.
No,
Apparently they are a thing in
Yeah,
Dartford
wow.
Heath.
Glory
It's where the wolves live.
I'll bet it is.
the ships
Now
hide.
we've all followed the vehicle in front in like foggy or snowy weather. I know I've done it, and so all of us have done it. And you find
But the
yourself.
distance would have varied,
Yeah,
wouldn't it,
yeah,
between
but
the-
we all do it. So none of us can cast the first stone there. So we're very much going to forgive. All reasonable people will forgive.
This comes from Jim. Thank you very much, Dee, for sending this in. And it's got a New Year kind of thing happening with this story. Dear Father Simon and the collective, the sin for which I seek forgiveness occurred 20 years ago, one dark and frosty New Year's Eve, when I was employed as a guard. I should have some sound effects.
Foghorn.
We got the dog.
Well, there's some wolves on the line. Anyway, I was employed as a guard by the late and sometimes lamented British Rail. One night in question, myself and 2 driver colleagues had been sent from our base in Hampshire to London's Paddington Station. Here we took charge of a train of carriages hauled by a steam locomotive to run a celebratory New Year's Eve excursion on a round trip to Salisbury. Kind of a nice way to see in the new year. As the special ticket-bearing passengers filled the train, there was a general atmosphere of bonhomie and goodwill to all. But not long after I had blown my whistle and waved my green light toward the steam locomotive, a note of discord crept into proceedings. As we headed through a moonlit Thames Valley, one of a group of passengers occupying the compartment next to my guard's van came to tell me in a loud voice how rubbish the British railway system was, and all who worked on it, they were rubbish as well. He gave every appearance of being a Tim Nice but Dim sort of character, if you remember him from the Harry Enfield series. That was when he was sober, but having had 1 or 2 drinks, he turned into his nastier twin, Tim Nasty and Dim. He kept up this boorish sermon for a good quarter of an hour before I managed to extricate myself and walk through the train to see that all was as it should be. Upon my return, Tim Nasty and Dim reappeared, bellowing in my ear, "Oi, guard!" as I passed the compartment door. Over the next half hour or so, I was made the long-suffering butt of a series of tedious jokes concerning leaves on the line, being late, wrong sort of snow, all that kind of thing, whilst his clearly embarrassed companion stared at the floor and fervently wished it would open beneath them. Eventually, after enduring several more bellicose interruptions, the train stopped at Andover in Hampshire, where our by now somewhat thirsty steam locomotive was to take on water. This procedure occupied about 15 minutes, during which I took the opportunity to escape from Tim Nasty and Dim by joining the slightly lubricated and merry throng of passengers gathered around our simmering locomotive. As our departure time approached, I returned to my guard's van and kept an eye on the locomotive. Just as my colleague on the footplate indicated they had finished taking water, Tim stumbled onto the platform. "Oi, guard fella, where's the bogs then?" he shouted at me in a particularly irksome manner. With a barely controlled rage boiling inside me, I managed to reply in a steely calm voice, "Why, down the stairs, through the subway and up on the other side of the platform." No sooner had he disappeared from view down the subway steps than I realised just how angry he was going to be when he found that they were not actually any toilets on the other platform. In fact, no toilets at all. But actually not half as angry as he was going to be when he found out that the train had left without him. And so it came to pass that I quickly waved a green light toward the engine, and with an answering toot and a hiss of steam, we set off into the night once more, but without Tim. I was not unduly concerned about our missing passenger, as I knew that in about 90 minutes' time the train was due to stop there again on its way back to London to see in the new year with a few fireworks and a chance to sing Auld Lang Syne on the platform. Neither, it seemed, were Tim Nasty but Dim's erstwhile companions too concerned by his absence, as they now laughed and made merry with gay abandon. Soon the train was reaching its destination and running into the cathedral city of Salisbury. Here the steam locomotive was to be turned for the trip back to London, and a fresh crew of drivers and guard were waiting to take over the train. In the throng and exchange of best wishes and the rush to uncouple the engine, I completely forgot to mention that a somewhat annoyed passenger will be awaiting the new guard at Andover, only remembering with a pang of guilt as we celebrated the new year in our taxi home on the A36. The story does not end there. A few days later, I bumped into the guy who was the fresh guard as I arrived for work in the early hours. I asked him rather sheepishly how the stop at Andover on the return journey had gone. He raised his eyebrows and shook his head. "Oh, well, it took so long to get the passengers back on the train at Salisbury that we had to stop one station early for the fireworks and Auld Lang Syne." A wistful look came over him as he continued, "Gosh, we must have made a fine sight tearing through Andover, all whistles and steam at well over 70 miles an hour. And so, Father Simon, I have to seek forgiveness not only for abandoning Tim Nasty but Dim, but for inflicting this boorish upper-class twit on the good people of Andover whilst they innocently and blamelessly tried to celebrate New Year's Eve It was 20 years ago, but let's see if he gets any forgiveness. I think he's probably... I know what Matt's going to do, because there's a hint of class war in his eye and a little bit of malice, a forethought. Anyway, what do you say there, Sister Rebecca?
Well, this Tim person sounds like a really horrible piece of work, so he deserved it. I mean, it's a season of goodwill, for goodness sake, and all he can do is attack the British Rail Guard for working for British Rail. I mean, his companions didn't even care, by the sound of it, so he probably was a really nasty piece of work. So I'm just relieved that the Fresh Guard wasn't bearing the brunt of Tim's wrath by picking him up at Andover, and he deserved it, so completely forgiven.
In Andover, apparently, these days, there are wolves. Did you
No,
know?
they're not.
There are.
No, just because you've got the wolves effects again.
Yes.
No.
Okay. What do you think? Novice Nigel?
Gosh, take some eating, those wolves. Basically,
Better than monkfish, though.
you give it. We'll find out. You give out what you get back what you give out, and he gave out some terrible things. Did Tim nasty, but dim. So on this occasion, Jim, you feel free to wave your flag and your lantern at any time, anywhere, because you are definitely forgiven from my perspective.
I think it's going to be forgiveness all round, unless Matt's being particularly contrary.
Nobody's going to really be in Tim's corner on this one, and I'm certainly not. Why does he think that the guard's going to know where the toilets are in Andover? That strikes me as rather odd. He's not going to have an encyclopedic knowledge of toilets throughout every station on that line. Well, no, nobody does.
It's a special hobby.
Moving on. So I am going to say definitely forgiven for no other reason than the toilets.
Good. Nicely thought out.
Logical as always.
Well, they were this week's confessions. Let us know your own shadowy secret, may be inspired by one of those you just had. We know you have a few tucked away. The email is to confessions@bbc.co.uk, or you can go via our website. More in a week's time, and the Weekly Mayo available to download now and every Friday. Thank you so much.